Well, I'm Ken Bibry, and welcome to Coffee with Ken, a thought leadership series at the nexus of business and politics. We are in 2025, our fifth year of hosting Coffee with Ken. Started shortly after the pandemic as a way to kind of stay engaged and catch up with people. And 5 years later, we're still doing it. We're in person, we're virtual, and we're just having a blast. Today, we get to have a really special conversation. One of the best parts about Coffee with Ken is it's an excuse to catch up with old buddies. And Jason Kander and I had the privilege of going to American University together, and through the years, I've kind of kept in touch, and I've just been blown away by everything you've been working on, Jason, from running for office, serving our country, writing a book, and my goodness, I put on 60 Minutes, and there you are. So, I mean, how you been? How's it going?
I'm great, man. Thanks for inviting me. It's good to catch up with you. You've been doing a lot as well. And, when I first knew you, it was because your name was everywhere at American University because you were a budding, yet very successful collegiate politician. So,
I peaked early, Jason. I peaked early. Now I just drink coffee now. So
well, I mean, some would say that there was not the peak, and this is much better. So,
well, I'm enjoying it. Well, listen, like I was blown away by this story. I think we all watched kind of in horror how kind of the US exited Afghanistan. And I heard from folks in my community in Northern Virginia that had served in Afghanistan who were kind of doing what I now realize you were doing, which was calling people who brought them in, who helped them in Afghanistan, who translated for them, who were really partners in a broader mission. And a lot of them felt left behind. But that I think really you took it to the next level in an effort to kind of help, you know, members of your community and extended family. Tell us a little bit about this and Operation Vanilla and what you were up to the last couple of years.
yeah. So in August of 2021, I was like a lot of Afghan vets, just like you were describing, like truly distraught in what I was seeing. And I reached out to my translator, Salam Raoufi, who thankfully is in the United States and was in the United States at the time. And we were just sort of like I was with a lot of my battle buddies that I served with, really just sort of being there to be supportive of one another as we were, watching this trauma unfold. And then at some point, he heard from family members over there and told me that his nephew Rahim Raufi was the leader of this large family of 12, and that Rahim had done a lot for the United States. And now the Taliban were after Rahim, and he needed help. And I'm very close to Salam. We were like a buddy comedy together over there, and so anybody close to Salam is somebody that I cared about. I reached out to Rahim thinking at the time that, this will be something I'll try to do for a couple weeks before the, August 31st deadline comes up and all the US planes are gone. But I thought beyond that, there's nothing to be done. I had never, to my recollection, met Rahim and the family, but I had when I was with Salam over there, 17 years ago now, I was eating the food that Raheem's mother was making, who was part of this group that needed to get out, because Salam was always bringing leftovers, and so I had no idea I had this connection beyond just their uncle. And I know it's such a crazy story. I never know where to go with it, other than to say I spent a couple weeks trying to get an opportunity to get them inside the airport. Unfortunately, the attack happened at Abbey Gate, and everything closed down. And then it was by that point, I had a couple other battle buddies that their guys they had served with had come out of the woodwork needing help because they were being hunted. And, this is a 20-year war. So everybody who had helped now had families. And so now the families are the ones that the Taliban are looking for as well. And, you know, one thing led to another. And the next thing I knew, I was sort of a de facto leader of this group that had grown because as we had gone to try to raise money to do this, other veterans had come out and said, people I didn't know who came to me and said, well, I have somebody. And the next thing I knew, we had close to 400 Afghan allies hiding out in various places around Mazar-e Sharif, Afghanistan, because we had asked them to go north to try and get further away from where the Taliban had such tight control. And we were trying to raise money to get an airline chartered in there to fly them out.
Wow. So you're doing all this, obviously time zones, right? So like what, in the middle of the night? And how many folks on your end, kind of military buddies, were helping you out?
There were about a dozen of us on our side, and yeah, we just weren't sleeping. I mean, because
Yeah.
it's a huge time difference, and so um, really the only way to do it is as you're supporting the families on the ground, you've got to be on Kabul time,
Mm.
And then the rest of the time, like, you're trying to live your life here. Like, I had a day job. I was coaching little league, which was a truly surreal and also sleep deprived experience.
And this went on for a while, right? So walk us through like kind of like steps. So you get them kind of to the north, and then there's an effort to get them out of the country, but that's not like just booking a plane ticket and getting out of there where the Taliban has control and they're hunting, people that were friendly to the United States.
Right. So the airport in Kabul was shut down, and I mean, it is not an exaggeration to say that there were literally no planes, not only flying out of Afghanistan, no planes flying over Afghanistan. Like, we had a radar app on our phones that we would turn on, and it was an Afghanistan shaped hole in the air traffic. There were no airplanes. And there there were these 6 planes that we knew that were gonna fly out of Mazar-e Sharif that had privately been chartered, and they were all Cam Air, the what had been kind of the airline of Afghanistan, but they only had, I think, 6 planes in their fleet, and what they were trying to do was get landing rights to fly into the US Air Base in Doha. They gradually, over the 3 weeks that passed, got those, but none of our people were on those flights, right? Our people were hiding out, and what we were trying to do was raise the money and then get landing rights for us to be the 7th plane. So what we needed was to create a situation where the 6th plane, once it flew out, could land in Doha, turn around, fly back, and we could get our people on the plane. The problem was numerous, but a couple of the problems were, one, you can't take off if you don't have somewhere to land. Like, literally,
Yeah.
if you don't have landing rights somewhere, you can't get rights to take off. That was the least of our problems. The most of our problems was the Taliban was looking for all of these 383 people, and the way it worked was, if they found them if they found them anywhere in Afghanistan, they could do whatever they wanted. They were the Taliban, they run the country, they could shoot them in the head, they could throw them in prison, and they would probably do one of those two things. But it was like this crazy game of capture the flag, because if if you secured landing rights and a foreign government sent a manifest, a flight manifest to the Taliban that had a full list of Afghans who had visas to get on that airplane, that was how you would capture the flag, because then now your people still weren't safe until they had to, like, show up unmolested. They had to, like, make it to the airport, get inside the airport, and then it's like the Taliban can capture them unless the Taliban have received this flight manifest from another country, and that flight manifest has all their names, all their information, because the Taliban, what they didn't want at that moment, they wanted to be just as brutal as they ever were inside the country, but they were, at least our theory at the time was, they were trying to have some sort of international relationships, which meant if somebody was expected to land later that day or the next morning in another country and they got thrown in prison or killed, now the Taliban have an international incident as opposed to just doing whatever they want to do in their country. So that was the game, was get a foreign government to issue landing rights and issue a full visa cleared flight manifest, and then fool the Taliban so that you can stage all these people in one place and sneak them, through town and then to the airport all at once. And then the other problem we had was, at that point, the US government was getting a lot of pressure because a lot of Afghans had gotten out while there were still like 100 Afghan Americans on the ground in Kabul. And so the State Department was receiving a ton of pressure to shut down any further flights into Al Udeid Air Base, which meant we suddenly found out that we couldn't use it. Now, what we ended up doing was we staged a fake wedding in Mazar-e Sharif. All these families had to stay in a wedding hall for a few days and hide and pretend that they were at a wedding so that it wasn't suspicious they were all staged in one place. All these families that the Taliban were looking for. And then we, through shuttle diplomacy, got the nation of Albania to issue landing rights and a visa cleared flight manifest. And so then you had the very harrowing journey for our Afghan allies to the airport, and then through a ton of Taliban checkpoints onto the plane, and they finally flew out and arrived at a 5-star hotel on the beach in Shane,
Endures, right?
Albania. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So
because I'm ethnically Albanian, so that made it even more of a unique story watching you on 60 Minutes and then understanding the Albania connection. And even in talking with friends from the State Department, their reference always about Albania is they were always willing to say yes, whatever the U.S. asked them, which was a kind of testament, I guess, with this situation.
Well, that was the trickiest part of this, though, Ken, is that the U.S. I sort of, and this is what was not in the 60 Minutes piece because they just didn't have time for it. The State Department didn't really want. It's not that they didn't want it to happen. They weren't going to go out of their way to let it happen, right? They had enough problems, and so I had somebody from within the State Department tip me off that the way it would work is that the Albanians were going to protocol said they were going to contact the U.S. embassy and say, "Hey, we're thinking of taking these folks in with the idea that they're eventually going to get to America. Are you cool with that?" And the person at state told me was, if they get any answer from the U.S. embassy other than yes, please do it, they're not going to do it. You know.
Ah,
And I was like, well, how do I get the U.S. embassy to give the answer I want? And they said, well, you can't. You have to find a way to keep the Albanians from asking the question. And that's where we had to get very creative. That's how we ended up at a fancy hotel because the Albanians basically said, well, if all we're talking about is some out of season tourism, then we don't have to ask the question. And so not only did we have to fool the Taliban, we had to defy the US government and fool them as well. So it was crazy.
this is like that movie Argo with Ben Affleck, where they
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
It's like if Argo, if they had to get 20 times as many people out and then it
yeah,
turned into a non-profit.
Russian Impossible.
Yeah, that then got another 2,000 people out because that's what we did later. And then the end of the story, the fun part into the story is that the Roofi family, after a long waiting process in Albania for visas, now has been here in Kansas City for about a year and a half, and they are part of our family, and we see them all the time, and we have dinners, and yeah, it's amazing.
Wow. So tell us more about your day to day. How are you spending your time, right? Like this obviously consumed the last few years of your life, but I imagine that's not even slowing down, but you're doing all kinds of veterans housing work. Like, how are you spending your time, including podcasting and everything else?
Yeah, so my day job is I'm the president of national expansion for Veterans Community Project, which it's a nonprofit started by veterans, run by veterans. We serve veterans, and what we focus on is fixing veterans homelessness and curbing veteran suicide. And so when I I came aboard in 2019, and it at that point it was a heralded, very special Kansas City focused social service agency that had gotten a ton of national attention because it is such an innovative and effective approach to both of those problems. But because of all that national attention, a lot of communities around the country were reaching out to Veterans Community Project, VCP as we call it, and saying, "Hey, can you come do it in our community?" And this was right after I had stepped away from, bas- for lack of a better way of putting it, stepped away from running for president. And so I had a national network, and so I, you know, joined up and have led the national expansion effort. And now we're, in addition to Kansas City, we're serving vets in St. Louis and Sioux Falls and Denver, and we just broke ground in the Phoenix area, and soon we'll do the same in Milwaukee. And then there's some other places in the works, and so it's been incredibly rewarding. In addition to that, as you mentioned, I wrote a book about my mental health journey with post traumatic stress in the military. I also speak about that from time to time, and I have a podcast called Majority 54, which is my co-host and I talk about progressive politics from the standpoint of folks in the middle of the country, and then I just actually started a podcast called The Game Within, which is about the politics and the business of sports and how it shapes what happens on the field.
Oh, wow. Fascinating.
Yeah, I'm excited. Actually, we will stream our second episode today.
Okay, very cool. Well,
Yeah.
take us back to the nonprofit, right? So, like, what is the ask of communities? Is it people giving you land? What I'm in the real estate business, so I always love to kind of hear stories like this. And what are you looking for? What can listeners who maybe have sites, like, how could they partner with you guys? How do they kind of address this? How do they do an assessment of like the actual demand for veterans, homelessness in their community?
No, I'm really glad you asked. Okay, the first thing is bad news, good news.
Yeah.
If you're in a major population center in this country, there's a demand for what we do. That's just the truth about veterans homelessness, and so set that aside for a moment. There are four basic things that we need in order to launch an expansion site. Uh, Number one, you nailed it, is land. We're a nonprofit. We can raise funds to purchase property, but we don't exactly have like a large land endowment, right? So um, we have done it both ways. In some cases, we have raised funds to purchase property. Uh, our preferred way, it's not the only way, but our preferred way is when it can be donated to us either by folks in the private sector, or sometimes it's done by governments. We generally, in order to build what we build villages of tiny houses for homeless veterans. They're very cool. Uh, and we build to a very high standard. So we generally need about 2 to 3 acres to do it. And so there's the land piece. And then there's a philanthropic piece, because to build one of our villages, the full capital campaign is usually between $7 and $11 million. That's, all in. We're usually able to start serving veterans before we complete that campaign. And then the third and fourth one are often one and the same, but I list them separately, and that is local champions and municipal support. Now, oftentimes what happens is a city council member or a mayor become the local champion, and that's great. But sometimes it's just a person who's very well connected in the community or very passionate, and they're the one that gets the ball moving. But because what we build is so unique, we're building, 240 to 320 square foot homes that are fully homes. I mean, they're built to the same international building codes as your house or mine. They have fully functioning kitchens and bathrooms, and they're hooked up to city utilities. Uh, there's almost no spot in the country where you could just build those without some sort of zoning variance.
Right.
So you got to have municipal support and buy-in. And that generally starts with good local champions who believe in it and want to get people on board. So that's generally what it takes.
That's incredible. Now, so much of your career to date has been around politics, right? So talk a little bit about your political history, right? You were in the legislature, ran for Secretary of State, you were on this trajectory. Talk about like what that was like for you, what path you were on, and then maybe kind of get into kind of your decision to pause and kind of, exit and deal with kind of, your own kind of mental health issues in that moment in time.
Sure. So I'm a fifth generation Kansas Cityan. My kids are sixth generation here in Kansas City. And I'm very tied to this place. And so I came home from serving with the Army in Afghanistan. I came home in early 2007. And by August of that year, I was knocking on doors to run for the state legislature, and was really driven by this sense that, look, I went to American University, right? We went to a school that was full of kids who were going to be president, right? So it would be ridiculous for me to say I just discovered that I was interested in politics. I chose to leave Kansas City to go to school in Washington D.C. at American and then at Georgetown for law school. Like, clearly, I had an interest, but to me, it was like up until that moment when I deployed and experienced that, I was this kid. I grew up in a certain amount of privilege, and no politician had ever made a decision that had negatively affected my life. So
Mm.
politics was like, I'd been a very serious about baseball in high school, and so like it was like an extension of that competitive instinct,
Yeah.
that and like high school debate and baseball and all that. But after I deployed, that was the first time I'd ever been on the receiving end of decisions that were made by politicians that negatively affected my life. And it granted me this ability to really understand to a greater degree, if not fully, but to a greater degree, the experience of people who were much less fortunate than me, like what it felt like to be let down like that. And so I came home extremely determined. And so I was 26, I think, and I ran for the state legislature in a race I had no business winning as far as everybody was concerned. But I had my military work ethic, and I knocked on 20,000 doors and then won the race overwhelmingly. And did 4 years in the legislature while I was still in the reserve component of the army. And then after 4 years, I ran for Secretary of State of Missouri. Missouri is a red state. I was a blue politician. I was a pretty progressive Democrat. And again, people were like, "It's not going to happen." But won in 2012, just barely. The race for Secretary of State actually became the first member of the millennial generation elected to an American statewide office, which grants you absolutely no additional power, but sounds extremely cool. And then served as Secretary of State for 4 years and ran for the United States Senate in 2016, and ran against an incumbent that had been in one office or another since prior to my birth, and in a state where on the same day that I was on the ballot for Senate, Donald Trump won my state by more than he won Mississippi. He won it by 19. Um, but despite that, I came within 2.8% of winning that race, which not many people expected, which sort of vaulted me. And I was kind of patient zero for the whole like Democrats who become famous by losing a race. I didn't think that was possible. I guess it happened, And the next thing I knew, President Obama was saying nice things about me publicly and inviting me in to talk with him about the possibility of me running for president. And then by 2018, I was hitting every primary state and I was running for president basically without saying the words. But this whole time, had symptoms that were getting much worse that whole 10-year period that I just, you know, went through in about, 3 minutes of post traumatic stress from my time in Afghanistan. And it really came to a head. And rather than do what I should have done, which was just go to the VA and stop what I was doing and go to the VA, I had this idea that, well, maybe what I was missing was the opportunity to serve my hometown because I cared so much about Kansas City. I still do. And so I announced that instead of running for president, I was going to run for mayor of Kansas City. And as you might imagine, if you go from running for mayor to running from president to running for mayor of your hometown, like you should be the front runner, and I was, and it should have been a really fun campaign. Um, but it wasn't because I was getting a lot worse. And so a few months before what would have been probably a pretty good victory on election day, I dropped out of everything and publicly announced that I was going to go to the VA to get help. And that's when I did get help at the VA. It was very helpful. In fact, Veterans Community Project, that's when it came into my life because that's how I got into the VA in a fashion that I probably wouldn't have without their help. And then, you know, 6, 7 months later, after going to therapy and feeling much, much better and like a different person, I dedicated myself to the nonprofit work.
That's amazing. So we had an interview last year with the leader of the National Military Families Association, and it's just one of these things. Every time I have one of these conversations, and just like how difficult it is when you come back home after serving your country and putting yourself out there. And I mean, what could and should we be doing as a country for our service members, our veterans who come home after risking it all on our behalf? I mean, it's just like it's criminal to me that that you even have to have this nonprofit, that it even needs to be in existence, that you have to ask for land and raise money and do this when people volunteer to actually serve our country.
Uh, well, let me give you a bifurcated answer. Let me give you the what the average person watching or listening to this right now can do on an individual level, and then I'll talk about from a policy perspective what I think needs to
Yeah.
change. On an individual level, like this would be the part where I should say you should buy my book, um, but which might help. But the book that I think is the most helpful with the specific question of how should we think about homecoming for veterans is a book by Sebastian Younger called Tribe. Um, and it really traces through human history how different societies have treated warriors when they come home and the ones that have got it right and the ones that have got it wrong. And it really effectively diagnoses why we struggle with it so much in modern America. And just one juxtaposition that I'll give you as an example is, he writes, and then I wrote about it as well in my book, and frankly cribbed him a little on it. But he blurbed my book, so I guess it's okay. Um, the way that Native American societies would welcome the warrior back, that they would bring everybody like a tribal meeting in, and the warriors would tell their stories to everyone in the tribe, their stories from battle. And that way they didn't have to feel alone in the tribe because now everybody had to listen to these fresh experiences. Whereas if you think about the difference, the way I put it in my book, Invisible Storm, is we give veterans like half off on a chicken fajita roll up at Applebee's on Veterans Day, and we're like, be the same person you were before you deployed. And there's a big dichotomy there. So what people can do is they can learn more about that experience and learn more about how to be there, be present with veterans to talk about those things. Um, so that's the individual level. At the macro level, if I could pinpoint one thing, it would be that when we make veterans policy in this country, we start with the wrong premise. We start with a premise, and this is not a VA problem because every politician of both parties loves to just, knock the VA because it's an easy thing to do when veteran stuff comes up. But it starts with Congress because when Congress creates a veterans benefit, the question that they ask is, how do we make sure that no one gets access to this benefit who doesn't deserve it? The problem with that is that it starts with the assumption that there are veterans who don't deserve access to these benefits. And when you do that, one, you do wall off a lot of people who do deserve it that aren't going to get it. But the other thing you do is you create the labyrinthine Byzantine structure that is the VA. And then they blame the VA for it. But the VA is just instituting all of these different guardrails. Yeah, they have to create a maze that you have to navigate to get to the benefits because every time Congress creates a benefit, they focus on who can't get it. And when we do that, we narrow the sight aperture so tightly that it's very hard for veterans to get access to their benefits. And also, there's a lot of stuff they're not eligible for. A lot of veterans refer to the system as chutes and ladders for
Yeah.
as a result. And so, like for instance, at Veterans Community Project, part of the reason we're so effective is we have a really simple eligibility standard. If you raised your right hand and swore the oath to the country, you qualify for 100% of our benefits. And if we did things that way at the VA level, and the VA care is often very good, if we did that at the federal level, well, what I would leave you with on that point is the statistic that most people are familiar with the stat that 22 veterans take their life every day in America. What few people know is that of that 22, on average, 16 of them are not connected to veteran specific services of any kind at the time they take their life. You absolutely will save lives if you make it easier to get connected to veteran specific services.
Incredible. Before I let you go, there was an election recently in the United States, and Democrats kind of seem to be just, wandering around and in search of the next Jason Kander. What's your kind of hot take of like the political landscape today? You're sitting in Kansas City. Advice to kind of Democrats around the country about how to kind of navigate and absorb what happened in this election in 16 and so on.
Yeah, I guess when I think about what happened, it's two things. One, I think it's important not to uh, overcorrect and to understand that you know President Biden inherit a couple of things happened for President Biden. One, inherited an economic situation coming out of a pandemic that was going to be incredibly difficult to climb out of. And the fact that Vice President Harris got as close as she did when you step back from things is kind of remarkable. Um, and, of course, the other thing that happened was I think the Afghanistan withdrawal was rightfully seen as really problematic politically, but obviously I'm biased, but from a policy perspective as well. So those things happened. But then the other thing that I think for the Democratic Party writ large for us to understand is that it is very difficult to get people to vote for you if they don't think you like them. And and that doesn't mean that we have to, you know, um, tolerate racism or bigotry or any of that. That's not what it means. But as you said, I live here in the middle of the country. I got a neighbor who has a Let's Go Brandon shirt, and we get along. We have to. We're neighbors, right? That's what it's like here in Middle America, and it's still winnable. But the key to that is when we are saying to men, for instance, that you should vote for the Democrats because of your daughters or your wives, that's fine. They should. But it is not irrational for male voters, for instance, to look at that and say, "Yeah, but what about me?" Right? So I'm not saying men are the victims or anything like that. I'm saying it's math. You can't win elections by only campaigning to certain groups of people, and when the other side is saying to large swaths of the country they don't like you, they look down on you, you have to be very careful not to play into that. You'll notice I'm not advocating moderating any policy positions. I'm just saying you got to go to where people are. People talk a lot about, the fact that Democrats didn't really appear on Rogan and that kind of thing. And that's true, but I think it's bigger than that. It is where people and where voters in this country go for um for opinions of people, political or otherwise, that they trust, doesn't always start with politics, right?
Yeah.
Um, most I got a lot of friends who listen to Joe Rogan. they don't listen to Joe Rogan for his political opinions.
No.
In fact, if they did, they would have all voted for Bernie a few years ago when that's what he was doing. So they go to Joe Rogan because he's entertaining. And I know as a podcaster that when you're coming into people's AirPods, for a couple hours every week, whether they realize it or not, you become their trusted friend.
Yeah.
And so it is extremely important that we take our message to all places because you have to enter those trusted sanctums in order to penetrate, you know, what is people's guards being up in a real and reasonable way.
Hmm. And we were chatting about this earlier when we were kind of offline, but I'm spending some time traveling the country on big manufacturing projects, and majority of them are in red states, and it's been remarkable to kind of go into these states, and some of them were projects pursuing federal incentives that Biden put in, and like politics never comes up. These are economic development authorities and states and communities that care about jobs. They care about impacting their neighborhood. They want to have high quality, high wage opportunities, and it's just to your point about you and your neighbor, it's an opportunity to kind of come together and focus on things that are going to better our country, and that gets lost a little bit, I think, in some of our day to day these days. Yeah,
What most Americans want is for their family to be happy, healthy, safe, and nearby.
yeah,
And where the Democratic Party has too often missed is on that last one, nearby. And people think, oh, well, it's because we have coastal leadership that's too liberal. No, it's not about liberal or conservative or moderate or whatever. It's about when all of your leadership is overwhelmingly coastal, that means that they are from the places that we are all worried here in Kansas City, our kids will have to go to find opportunity. So as a result, it's hard for them to see how to speak to that. So when Trump goes out and he talks about tariffs and trade and all that kind of thing, people aren't sitting there with a Excel spreadsheet and figuring out which policy makes the most sense. What they're hearing purposefully by him, what he's having them hear, whether truthful or not, is I care about there being opportunities where you live now. And I actually think the Democratic policies are much more effective at making that happen, but we have to talk about it that way.
yeah. The storytelling's missing. Yeah. Amazing. Well, Jason Kander, it is always great to see you. I'm so excited about all the things you're working on, and huge kudos for this amazing work in Afghanistan and with veterans housing and so on. So always great to see you. I look forward to catching up in person next time. Everyone tuning in, thanks for watching. We're coffeewithken.com. You can follow us and subscribe on YouTube as well. And look, bottom line message: grab a cup of coffee, talk to someone this week, have a fun conversation, and spend some time kind of just listening to folks. So until next time, good to see you, Jason.
You too. Thanks, man.